It's been a few years since I created a series of list videos regarding my personal picks for underrated games on various systems. And since then, they've all strangely found a life of their own on the internet, and a lot of commenters have shared some games they wished would have been on the list. Well, some of them were just dicks, but the supportive ones bonded with me over our nostalgia, and I like those people. Anyway, for a year or more, I've been meaning to do a video series covering those game suggestions to see if they were really worthy, or if their picks were even worse than mine, but I always had something else going on and kept putting that project off. But these days...
Please stay inside and lock all doors and windows. Miller Park is no longer considered a safe haven. Please avoid the stadium and proceed to other locations.
I mean, I really don't have any excuse to not cover those games, so here I am, stuck inside playing viewer-suggested games, whether I like them or not. I don't really have any rules for this list, since I didn't pick the games myself, but I do want to manage this list similarly to how I did my suggested PlayStation 1 games, where I gave each game about an hour or so to hook me. So it's not a deep dive into them, but at least long enough to get a feel for the gameplay mechanics and whether they'd appeal to me. There are a few of these games that, while they were suggested by others, I also played and honestly just forgot to include before now, but I'll be sure to stipulate that since I'll know more about them. It's also worth noting that most of the games on this list are from Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS because those videos did the best and they got the most suggestions, but I see this as an ongoing list as more suggestions come in, so there's plenty of time to show other systems some love. Anyway, enough of my rambling. I'm just so lonely here. The cats don't talk to me, and outside is, well, bad. But there's a lot of games to escape with, so let's get into it.
Ninja 5-0.
I'll admit, I've never been super into ninja or stealth games, even beloved ones like The Messenger, but I'll give this little game some credit. It's a neat, arcade-style side-scroller action game, even if it feels a little too old-school for my tastes. It's kind of like if the notorious old NES Ninja Turtles game was actually good. There's a satisfying variety of moves, but the controls are kinda janky and the character never feels as skilled or responsive as other ninja characters. Most notably Ninja Gaiden, which had better ninja abilities as an NES game. The Spider-Man-style swinging mechanic to reach higher platforms feels especially terrible, but there's still a satisfaction to sneaking up on armed baddies and taking them out to save a hostage. There's just not much else to the game if you don't enjoy that arcade action loop. Plus, I learned that I'd make a pretty bad ninja. I am not a sneaky man.
Super Princess Peach.
This is actually a game I had played before and just didn't like enough to include on my personal list of underrated DS games. But because it was fairly regularly recommended by commenters, I still thought it was worth taking another look at for anyone that might stumble across this and like it more than I did. It's a solid platformer, but my main problem with it is the inconsistent emotions mechanic to level progression. The game calls them vibes, but come on. They made a female-led platformer where your powers are your emotions. Yikes. Anyway, there's often times when you need to use a certain emotion power and just don't have the available meter for it, so you have to skip the collectible or whatever you're trying to get. It's really frustrating to know what you need to do, as the puzzles are all fairly simple, but not be able to do it for arbitrary reasons. It's possible to refill the meter, but that can really slow things down, especially when the power is needed to actually get through the level and you just wasted all your meter on something pointless. I do have to take it back to the kind of problematic nature of finally having Princess Peach featured as the main character and then having her use her emotions as her power-ups. I feel like that wouldn't fly the same on modern consoles, and frankly, since it's not terribly well implemented, I wish they would have just done something different from the start. The powers themselves are clever, but don't need to be based on emotions. If anything, that makes them more confusing. She has the power to float on her tornado, which is... joy? And then she can burn bridges and things with her... anger? Sure. And the most egregious is her ability to cry on command to water plants. And her final power, I actually don't even remember because it feels like you never have to use it, but I looked it up and it's the ability to heal yourself, which is called Calm. It really feels like they could have tied these powers to elements and just built that into the story rather than going, she's a girl, she has emotions, and basing the game around that. Especially since she has other classic platforming abilities that are satisfying and fit her character better. Her parasol is really cool, for example, and she uses that to fight, float on water, and assist her jumps. There are also some great level designs and clever bosses, but when the entire gimmick of the game has spotty implementation, it just sours me on the whole game, even when there's moments when it all works.
Juga and the Monophobic Menace.
This game was a pleasant surprise for the most part. It has a really cute art style and a nice presentation with some nicely detailed cinematic story moments. It definitely feels more catered toward younger players, but for a game I'd never heard of before it was suggested to me, I found myself enjoying it quite a bit. You basically play as a sonically gifted alchemist in training who gets wrapped up in a plot against villainous robots when they threaten his village. The story doesn't seem the most interesting, but I like the way it mixes in different kinds of enemies, where some can only be taken out with crafted potions, and others can only be taken out by more tactical collection of enemy attacks turned into sonic blasts back at them. Overall though, as interesting as the individual mechanics are, the game definitely feels hampered just by being on the Game Boy Advance. The limited button layout means that everything is kind of slow and requires a lot of menu navigation. For example, creating potions requires going into the backpack menu and combining different numbers of colored ingredients, but the actual recipes for those potions are in a different menu. And you only create one potion at a time, so each time you use one on an enemy, you have to go in and make another one. Or make a bunch at once, but that means a lot of ingredient foraging, which also happens weirdly slowly. And since the character also moves slowly and there's no extra buttons for a run, the whole game really crawls along. And that's not even mentioning the sound staff attacks, which require collecting the correct pattern of enemy attacks in order to charge your own reciprocal attack. All these mechanics are really neat in a vacuum, but in practice the game doesn't handle them well. I think in almost every way, this game would be more successful on the DS, where the potion making could be on the bottom screen at all times, allowing you to quickly tap out potion recipes while on the move, and there'd be more buttons to help mitigate the number of menus you toggle between too. It's a shame though, because there's a lot of ideas to like in this game, and the way you use the potions to manipulate elements in the environment for light puzzle solving makes it feel kind of like a Harry Potter game. Except the GBA had a handful of Harry Potter games that arguably execute some of these ideas better. Speaking of...
Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban.
I'm actually a huge fan of the Harry Potter movie tie-in games from this era, having played most of them and even featuring the GameCube version of this exact game on my list of underrated games for that system. Somehow I completely missed that there was actually a pretty good turn-based RPG in the mix of all the different games across a variety of consoles, though. I guess it's fitting, though, that Prisoner of Azkaban gets the best range of games, since it's also the best of the movies. Don't fight me on this. Alfonso Cuarón is a treasure and he elevated that material. Anyway, while this game is still very obviously a budget cash-in, it also has a lot to offer fans of Harry Potter and RPGs alike. The battles don't look like anything special, with ugly backgrounds where the walls and floors parallax separately from each other, and zoomed in pixels you can see from space, but the actual mechanics are pretty neat. Each party member has their own special abilities, with Harry using collectible chocolate frogs to power different combo techniques, Ron using his knowledge of fantastical creatures, and Hermione scolding everyone with buffs. I think that's my favorite, actually. She's like a bard that everyone hates. Otherwise, just known as a bard.
Come here.
Yeah. Come on, Roach.
There's also a nice variety of spell attacks that power up the more you use them. It's a simple system, kind of catered to my first RPG for most of the player base, I'm sure, but it does the job well, and while I wish there was more enemy variety, they are nicely animated and their attacks have weight, even if death really doesn't. As always with these games, most of the gameplay content comes from added random bits rather than the actual story's plot, and I don't find most of that terribly interesting, but it works well enough to stretch out the available content, and the spells outside of combat add some fun puzzle variety, such as activating Lumos to light up hidden paths across a pit. This is far from the level of cinematic quality I'd expect out of the console versions, but as a handheld RPG, it definitely gets the job done, and does a good job at making you feel like a group of burgeoning wizards. It's one of the better examples of a Harry Potter tie-in game at least, and it kinda makes me mad that it's also one of the few I missed growing up. It works way better than the more clunky, action-oriented games that came before it, even if I'd still rather play this on GameCube instead.
Kirby's Air Ride.
I love Kirby as a character, and many of his games are my favorites of all time, but for some reason this is just one I never really knew much about. I didn't know any friends that owned it, so I didn't play it on GameCube, and ever since, I've heard it's kind of a weird spin-off game without much merit, so I never felt the need to go back. But I guess it's gotten a small cult following since, so I was told to give it a try, and you know what? It's kinda neat, actually. The controls are weird, and I never got used to the idea of only using the control stick and A. That seems like an unnecessary simplification since boosting and using power-ups both have to use the same button. Imagine if in Mario Kart, every time you threw an item, your cart braked a little. That'd be weird, right? So why did HAL think it made any sense? No idea, but the small control issue aside, there's a lot to like about mixing Kirby's copyability and star riding with traditional racing mechanics. The racetracks are really well detailed and varied with some super cool interactive elements. I will say things move so quickly sometimes that it can be hard to keep track of what's going on, especially when you grab a power-up and the aforementioned issue comes up of trying to boost and use your ability, but the attention to detail is impressive, and the strategy involved is different from most other racing games. And for the record, that only covers one game mode. There's a surprising variety of content here, even though there's weirdly no proper story mode or Grand Prix or anything like that to really encourage single-player progress. Another game mode is more of a gimmicky party mode, but it's still neat to try. It's kind of the same, but in a zoomed-out, top-down mode similar to Hot Wheels tracks. But sometimes it can be hard to keep track of everything since everyone is Kirby on a star, and it's not always clear what the things you pick up do, so while I appreciate its inclusion, I didn't get super into this mode. The final mode seems the most unique, and I wish it was fleshed out more. This is where they could have put in that story mode. It takes the same control scheme off the racetrack and into an open landscape with various stat boosts and things littered around to collect. The goal is to make your racer the strongest before the time runs out, and then win against the other players in a melee rumble against traditional Kirby enemies. It's really cool, and feels like kind of a precursor to the Smash Run mode and Smash Bros. 3DS, but it's also the mode where the limited control scheme hurts the game the most, since it really feels like you should be able to do more, but you just kind of drive around on autopilot and smack into boxes to grab what's inside. I'd love to see a Kirby game that fleshes this mode out more and ditches the gimmicky racing stuff. But as it is, I'm glad I finally tried this game. And while it'd probably be fun with a group of friends for a bit, the lack of any single-player content and clunky controls means I probably won't go back into it, even though it's not a bad game by any means. It's just strange.
Monster Tale.
This is another game I'd played back in the day, but not for long. I just remember thinking it was a neat take on the Metroidvania formula on a system that didn't have many other examples. But back then, something about it didn't quite click with me. It felt a little easy, and the idea of evolving a monster didn't seem fully realized, despite that being what the game is all about. When it was suggested to me, I looked it up again though, and thought I'd like it more, once I remembered that I'd played it. My initial impressions are still pretty accurate, as it kind of feels like baby's first Metroidvania game, where there's a map but not much to do with it outside of keep track of your next checkpoint. Any potential branching path is either just a save point or a dead end hinting at a power you don't have, so the only exploration to do is figuring which path actually takes you to that next power-up. It's still a really satisfying platformer action title though, with a quick sense of progression as your character gets stronger and you unlock new forms for your monster. While there's not much difference between them, at least early on, it's still neat to work towards all the different forms. Kind of like Eevee in the Pokemon games. The coolest element of the game, though, is how it uses the dual screens to mix up the gameplay. The bottom screen basically houses your HUD, as well as a kind of a Tamagotchi mechanic, where you can recharge the stamina meter of your monster and give it various items to help promote its growth through leveling up and evolving. One form might prefer sweet items like cookies, while another form might like to exercise using dumbbells, and another likes playing with toys. There's also some minor puzzle rooms and boss mechanics that make use of the switching your monster between the top and bottom screen mechanic, and those kinds of things make the game feel clever and different in a way that a lot of DS games don't take advantage of. It was a truly unique system, and it feels like the games that do the coolest things with the system's capabilities are also the most underrated ones. Even I'd forgotten to include the game on the actual underrated DS games list, and I played it, so I'd imagine most people never heard of it at all. And speaking of unique DS games I forgot to put on the original list...
Henry Hatsworth.
This is one that actually made me mad when it was suggested to me, because I felt so dumb for forgetting about it. I loved this game so much on the DS originally, like 15 years ago. Jeez, I'm old. But speaking of old, this game is about a posh old man treasure hunter who finds a magical golden hat that makes him young and gives him extra powers. But he's not satisfied with just the hat and goes out on an adventure to put together the whole golden suit. It's a pretty ridiculous premise for a game, and in general the whole thing feels like they could have swapped out Wario and it would have worked just as well as a Wario Land 5. But as much as I also think Wario Land 4 didn't get enough love, I'm still glad this was an original IP because it allows it to have its own charm and a unique cast of pretentious, posh characters that feel ripped out of a Professor Layton game. The coolest thing about this game isn't the fantastic art style or the fun action platformer levels with satisfying combat variety, it's the way it manages to use the uniqueness of the DS to shoehorn in a bottom screen puzzle mechanic in a way that doesn't feel shoehorned in. I've stated before how much I love block flip puzzle games like Tetris Attack, and while this is a drastically simplified version of that, where there's really no benefit to pulling big block combos or anything like that, it's still really cool, because when you take out enemies in the level, you also have to take them out in the block puzzle, or they'll come back and attack you in block form. There's also sometimes buffs and health bonuses in the puzzle you can grab during clutch moments if you're not as good at the combat system, which I'm not. I'll admit, I like the puzzle stuff more than the actual action platforming, because Henry's melee has very precise hitboxes and terrible range, and his gun can be tough to aim. Plus some of the beefier enemies can be brutal with how little health he has early on. But the whole game is great and a really unique blend of mechanics that wouldn't really be possible in any other system. Oh, and did I mention you can turn into a robot? 'Cause yeah, you can turn into a robot for some reason. It's pretty dope. This game rocks. And there we have it, the first set of suggested games in the can. And hey, some of them you can even play on the can. Like I said before, I don't know exactly how many parts this will be, but right now I have 3 videos worth of games to cover, so I'll see you in a few weeks with more. I mean, hey, it's already been a few years since I said I'd do this. What's a few more weeks? Especially right now, where else are you gonna go? There's zombies outside, or something. I haven't left the house in a while, I don't know what it's like. But until the next video, please share your thoughts on these games, and feel free to keep sharing your own underrated game picks. Though, right now, you might end up telling me about ones I'm already planning to cover. Or, you can just tell me how none of these games are underrated. I'm used to hearing that already, but at least this time it wouldn't be my fault. I didn't pick these games. Anyway, until next time, have fun. And stay safe. Don't let the COVID zombies get you. I do want to manage this list similarly to how I Scrolls. Scroll, 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 scroll. This is my scroll and wait song. Scroll, 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 scroll. There we go. I don't really have any rules for this list since I didn't pick games myself, but I do want to manage this list similarly to how I did my suggestion place. The word similarly is going to kill me. When the entire gimmick of the game has spotty implemented. I guess I have to write everything as like short words. You can't do more than a few syllables. I'm like our president. But when the entire gimmick of the game has spotty Juka and the monophonic. The title on this one's tripping me up.